I took a course in hypnotherapy with the School of Hypnotherapy in Palo Alto. It was roughly like a 10-week course, right? Like quarter length. And in it, you learn some of the fundamental aspects of doing hypnotherapy. And then neurodiagnostics. So basically, I did a little bit under Professor Olga Lushakova-Schwartz. I worked in the lab, in the neurodiagnostics lab with her, and did a little bit of work under her supervision. I myself have been writing for a number of years, and writing is a craft, right, in and of itself, and it's a craft that improves with time. So you need to practice it just like any other talent, right, or ability. The more you practice it, the better you get at it. Myself, in my pedagogical trajectory, you know, I first started off in behavioral science, all right? So my formative degree a while ago was in behavioral science. I started off with a Bachelor of Behavioral Science at La Trobe University, then left academia or studies for a while, right, to explore the world and engage in a pilgrimage of self-discovery like many other people do. I wanted to explore the outer world, and then came back and thought, okay, I'm somebody who really values expression and self-expression. What's one way in which I can express myself? And that was through poetry and writing, right? So I move, you know, in an interdisciplinary fashion, you know. I go from one field to the next in search of knowledge, collecting knowledge, you know, creating a repository of knowledge, and then hoping to give back in a specific way. And the way that I wish to give back is to, I suppose, work with patients, right, in a clinical context, and help people through the things that I've learned. I primarily operated through the writing modality, right? So I started writing poetry very early in my life, then got into a little bit of creative nonfiction. I wrote fiction as well. I've written a book of fiction, which has yet to be released. So I'm all about the expressive arts. I'm about the performing arts as well. So I play the synthesizer, right, or the keyboards. So I started when I was about 11 or 12 years of age, and, you know, have kept up with it. And the way that I came to drawing, right, you know, kind of like the visual form, or honoring the visual form, is through my cousin, Chris. So Chris, my cousin, is an artist. He's a very talented artist, I would say. He ended up drawing, how many, I don't know, roughly 20, 25, he did 20, 25 paintings that were included in my book, Shades of Aphrodite, In Search of the Golden Apple. So there's a specific sequence in my book, right, a creative non-fictional component called the concurrence, which he illustrated, right? So he read these pieces and he illustrated them. And these were some incredibly emotive pieces. I looked at these and I was like, wow, okay, these are quite impressive, they're very compelling. Maybe I should try my hand at drawing too. Given the fact that I've only expressed myself through the written word, let me try my hand at something else. And that's how it started. So roughly at the end of first year, when I was in my doctoral studies for clinical psychology, we did a specific subject, right? So in personal development, right? And I said to myself, okay, why don't I start drawing? And I started drawing. So one of the assessment tasks was to come up with a specific journal and either write or draw or use some kind of like multimodal, you know, form to express yourself. And I decided to utilize dialogue and drawing, right? And I started drawing. Can't say that I was impressed by some of the first pictures that I actually drew. But I think I've improved somewhat with time. So that was my first contact with the visual form, right? With the visual form of art. And, you know, since that time I've been drawing intermittently, right? So I go through periods of waxing and waning. There are some times where I draw more, there are other times where I draw less. It's a work in progress. So a lot of these drawings are in the Confessions of a Split Mind book, which is the compendium of drawings and philosophical dialogues that I did. Then some of them are in the book, The Creative Advantages of Schizophrenia, and then some of them are in the current book, which is the book on Precognitive Dreams. So for me, the experience of drawing, obviously it's a non-dual experience, right? I felt really connected with the process. And it wasn't so much about what the final creative product would look like. You know what I mean? I didn't do it because I wanted to create the Mona Lisa, for instance. Sometimes I will sit down with a specific preconceived notion of what I want to create. It might not come out the way that I had envisioned it. Do you know what I mean? But it tends to be, it's not that planned, right? There's not that much pre-planning that goes into it, right? So it feels sometimes it feels more like a random process. Like I'll sit down and I know roughly what I want to create, but I don't know exactly the dimensions or the shape or how I want it to look, right? And the process will start to unfold and it'll draw itself. It feels very mindless, right? It's not like I'm really contemplating anything. I'm just sitting down and I'm like, okay, this is what I want to create. And, you know, I may draw inspiration from things that I've seen before, right? You know, like, I don't know, like a piece of art that I've seen before. Sometimes I scour the internet and I'll see specific statues or drawings, right? And I'll be like, oh, that looks interesting. You know, think about what that might convey metaphorically. Maybe I can convey it into incorporate it into one of my drawings. Does that make sense? This specific drawing ended up being the cover of the book. Here we have a woman who is faceless and she's kind of contemplating the mysteries of the cosmos. So this is kind of like the physical realm, right? The realm, the quantifiable, the material realm. Then here we have specific shadows. These are the people in the world who are moving about in an almost mindless state, in a hypnotic state, not necessarily aware of the wonder and majesty of the greater universe, right? So that's why they're portrayed as shadows. Then we have like this little wheel in the middle, right? So it kind of looks like a clock, right? With all the different gadgets and pieces that it comes with. And it's almost like a chronometer, you know, measuring time, the cycles of time, and it alludes to time. So that's the centerpiece. Here, it says 2019 because that was the year in which I drew the picture. So it's set here at 2019. There's various winged beings that are flying around, right? So these are the entities that are outside of the purview of our sensory experience or our sensorium. Then we have the all-seeing eye of God, which is a common motif in so many different esoteric works, right? We see the eye of God, we see it in many religious drawings as well. Birds, right, have a special connection with birds. When you think of wings and flying, we think of spirituality, we think of elevation, sublimation, right? So that's why I've incorporated the birds in here, and then there's this big heart, more kind of like an abstract piece, like the centerpiece here, which is the heart that's beating, the something which powers the universe that we're not necessarily aware of, right? That remains outside of our awareness, something which powers the universe and which is moving it forward. So basically, I mean, if you were to ask me what does this drawing convey, I would say that it conveys, I suppose, the material and physical aspects of the universe, but also the paraphysical dimensions of the universe as well. The parts of the universe that remain outside of our cognitive closure, parts that we don't necessarily, we're not privy to, that we can't experience or see, right? So, yeah, that's the drawing. Something very compelling to me, something which kind of resonates with me on a very deep level, is the metaphor of day and night, right? If we compare it with, I suppose, waking experience and dream experiences, right? So waking cognition and dreaming cognition, so the relationships are very similar. So for instance, during the day, you know, the sun's around, right? So you can't see the stars, you can't see the moon, you can't see the planets, right? At nighttime, obviously after the setting sun, certain things become visible in the night sky, right? The stars, the twinkling stars, the wandering planets. So same thing with cognition, the sleep-wake cycle, right? So during the day, there's so much noise around, right? We're going about frantically, our lives frantically, trying to rush from place to place. We're externally anchored. We're anchored to the external environment. We're not anchored to the inner environment, right? So the inner life. So we're not as attuned to the inner life. So then at nighttime, we withdraw to our homes, we withdraw to the sanctuary of our bedrooms, and then we fall asleep. and then we start to experience certain internal phenomena, right? Idiosyncratic internal phenomena. And some of these are going to be dreams, and dreams usually occur as narratives. And precognitive dreams or precognitive fragments are sometimes interwoven into that tapestry, into the dream tapestry, but they occur on a very subtle level. So to be sensitized to them, we need to be aware first and foremost that they exist and that they occur, and number two, create the environmental milieu or design the environmental milieu in a way that makes it conducive to the eruption of those sorts of dreams, right? Or the manifestation of those sorts of dreams. So yeah, it's an interesting, the whole metaphor of day and night is an interesting parallel. It's a dream type that not many people have actually heard about, right? So they're called, I mean, in the scientific jargon, we might use the word precognitive dream. Most commonly, they're referred to as predictive dreams, right? Some people say premonitions, but I think the correct word is a predictive dream. So basically, if I were to explain it in a simple way for you, it's a dream type where it's a profound experience, like you'll see something in a specific dream, and usually something will play out, something that played out in the dream segment will occur again in real life. Okay, so a specific narrative which unfolds in the dream world will also unfold in real life. Okay, so that's called a precognitive dream. It's called precognitive, so because it refers to retrocausality, right? So reverse causality, so the effect preceding the cause. Precognitive dreams are obviously incompatible with the unidimensional linear model of time, specifically what I call the Newtonian, Descartesian kind of epistemological box, right? The idea of time as being forward movement, as being a forward movement of sorts. Obviously, with precognitive dreams, they imply retrocausality. How does that fit into a unidimensional model of time? Well, guess what? It actually doesn't, right? They're fairly incompatible and incongruent. And I think for a lot of people, the idea of a precognitive dream is the source of a lot of cognitive dissonance, right? So they don't quite know how to categorize them, how they fit in. So it's better to either ignore them or under rug sweep them. You know, there are various standpoints or, opinions around why precognitive dreams actually exist and the underlying, mechanism of action. So we have specifically Edgar Cayce, who supposed that there was an aspect of the self that scanned ahead in the dream state and actually could illuminate some of the steps or some of the actions that would lead to a specific outcome, and then select those specific states so that outcome would be realized. Okay, so that's Edgar Cayce. Then we have John William Dunn, who came up with a whole theory, his theory of serial time and serialism, which was kind of like the religious component of serial time, right? And serial time, so what he proposed was that just like there's three dimensions to space, there's probably more than one dimension to time, right? So, when Newton came up with the whole space-time continuum, he supposed that there was three dimensions of space and only one dimension of time. So with John William Dunn, he's saying, no, there's more dimensions of time. And there's a dimension, time one, which is this forward-moving or unidimensional linear time. Then there's time two, which measures time one. Then there's a time three, which measures time two, right? And there's the specific aspects of oneself that corresponds with that specific time, right? With those times. We're not couching or presenting it in an absolute sense, right? This isn't what absolutely is going to happen. This is the most likely trajectory or the most likely outcome, but it's not definite. It's not set in stone, right? Well, the interesting thing is that a lot of people think that precognitive dreams are the prerogative of mystics and seers, and they're actually not. So when you say who can have precognitive dreams, people like you and me can have precognitive dreams. And guess what? We do. You know, the dream world is this mumbo jumbo of, you know, random extraneous stimuli that are kind of bombarding you, bombarding like your perceptual interface. How do I know that a specific dream is going to be a precognitive dream? Well, the truth of the matter is that you actually don't, right? Not until the associative waking experience has actually transpired, right? So, and the way that you know is you might be going about your day and you might have a specific deja vu experience where, for instance, you know, like you'll pick up a vase and you'll carry it from one side of the room to another. And then you'll think to yourself, oh wait, I've done this before. Where have I done it before? Well, I haven't done it in real life. And it's like, oh wait, maybe I've done it in the dream state. Do you know what I mean? And then you may remember a specific dream fragment where that specific event was unfolding, right? So it's like, oh, there's the connection. So I've done this somewhere before, I've done it in the dream state. So that's where how you make the connections. They won't always be salient or obvious, right? But the main point or key is to write down as many things as from the dreams that you can remember, right? So then you can make the connections afterwards. What you should do is get into the habit of writing these dreams in a journal or in a diary or whatever, right? So you want to transcribe, you want to write about all of these dreams and try and recollect as much information as you can, right? So put it all down on paper. And the best way to do that is once you awaken in the morning, don't move around too much, right? Because it'll take you out of that specific experience, right? So just remain motionless, kind of like in that kind of hypnoid state. And just think, try and grab hold mentally of what was the last thing that you saw that you may have experienced in the dream state. And usually when you remember one thing or one specific element, then other things will start coming back to you, right? So it's kind of like an anchor. Once you grab hold of that anchor, that dream anchor, other pieces will actually start to come back as well, right? So you'll start to unearth other pieces. And then you just write them all down, right? As much as what you can remember. In the beginning you won't be able to remember much. As you become more well-versed, you'll start to remember many more aspects of your dreams. So you write them all down. Usually the temporal factor or the temporal window between a precognitive dream fragment and an associative dream experience, the associative waking experience which corresponds to that precognitive dream is usually about a day or two. Some people have, will have a specific associative waking experience that occurs days later. Other people might have it a month or so later, or sometimes maybe a year later. But more often than not, it's usually a day afterwards. At the end of the day, or maybe the next day, return to this specific book, and without looking at what you wrote, the sort of dreams that you transcribed, just write what you did during the day, right? Once you do that, go back to the precognitive episodes that you wrote down and see if you can make any connections between the two, right? So have a look at the precognitive dreams and say, okay, is there any connection between what happened in today, right? As I was moving through the day today with any of these precognitive episodes, right? Is there any specific connection? Sometimes something will occur to you without writing anything down. For instance, like you'll go through the motions of the day and something will happen and you'll be like, oh my God, that happened in my dream, right? So something which is, analogous to what happened in the dream state. Sometimes it can be a carbon copy, right? You can replicate in precise terms what happened in your dream. Other times it'll be something which is, analogous but not exact to what actually happened. And there's a specific connection made. Okay, so that's a specific method that was used by Dunn. I also use that specific method as well. Cool. So here is the book itself. So a critical investigation into precognitive dreams, Dreamscaping without My Timekeeper, which was published in April of this year by Cambridge Scholars Publishing, without My Timekeeper, because we are alluding to time as illusory, right? So let's open this up and let me share some of the dreams or the precognitive dream fragments with you. This specific precognitive dream fragment comes from Ms. P, and she is a 55-year-old woman. This is dream 12. In yet another vivid dream, which occurred in the early morning of July 22nd, 2011, Ms. P is camping out in a tent on a beautiful island when she is approached by a tall, stocky man with a deep, raspy voice and a fair complexion. His physiognomy, vocal prosody, and mannerisms unnerve her. "You will have to come and join me then," he tells her. She awakens from her slumber in the morning with a sense of foreboding. Okay, so this is the actual waking event. After coming home from work that evening, Ms. P made herself a cup of tea and reclined on her couch in anticipation of the late night news. The television was on mute, but she was still privy to the streaming visual media. Without warning, the same man and accompanying topographical backdrop from her dream flashed up on the screen. The man is none other than Anders Behring Breivik. I don't know if I have the pronunciation correct. A radicalized Islamophobic man with psychopathic leanings and a far-right ideology. The setting is Norway. Turning the volume up, she discovered that he had just gone on a blood-curdling rampage, killing no less than 77 innocent civilians with explosives and a semi-automatic pistol. Okay, so the interval between that specific dream fragment and the waking event, less than 24 hours. Okay, so, and these are some of the observations, right, and some of the critical analysis which I wrote about afterwards. According to the participant, there was a striking resemblance between the dream figure who uttered the words, "You will have to come and join me then," and Breivik. Archive documentation from Breivik's trial and sentencing offers up a very interesting fact relating to superluminal communication. According to Breivik himself, hundreds of individuals attempted to project themselves into his mind and appeal to his moral conscience for the sake of averting the calamity. Here it should be mentioned that owing to dimensional displacement from fourth dimension to third dimension, the transmission of authentic information through visual imagery and sound will never be exact, right? This would explain why the real Breivik and the ethereal double who intruded into Ms. P's dreamscape were comparable but not exactly the same. There are two pivotal rudiments to this supernormal vision: a precognitive intrusion of the psychopath and the land on which the catastrophe unfolded, and a peculiar utterance suggestive of telepathic communication, right? So there's a supernormal piece in this dream as well. In the first rudiment, we have a phenomenal expression through the evening news of psychic images in the dreamscape of Ms. P. In the second, we have a phenomenon which can only be described as an entanglement of minds in a collective unconscious. Owing to its telepathic nature, this dream fragment is a piece of anecdotal evidence substantiating the reality of psi phenomena. Okay, so that's the first one. Okay, so now I'm going to narrate dream 25. So this is one of my own precognitive dream experiences. The dream fragment commences in the backyard of a house resembling Mr. A's own. Mr. A has just finished brewing an alchemical concoction, a white elixir, in the garage and then thrown it onto the roof for some unknown reason. In order to retrieve the treasured item, he positions a ladder against the chrome-colored wall on the south side of the house and climbs up to the edge of the roof. At some point, Mr. A remembers he is acrophobic. He makes the terrible mistake of peering down and is nearly overwhelmed by a dizzy spell. Not wanting to climb any higher, he reaches up to the terracotta roof shingles and begins searching frantically for the stoppered flask with only his hands as his guide. Without any warning, an excruciating pain shoots up his right arm. He retracts his hand and sees that he's grazed it against crumbling bits of obsidian. The injury is quite severe. Glass fragments have caused lacerations by wedging themselves into the palm of his hand, causing blood to spurt like a fountain. Mr. A is awoken by his own scream. The waking event. Mr. A was entertaining himself in the backyard by throwing a tennis ball around. I remember this explicitly too. It was an energetic activity that evoked playfulness and exuberance on his part. At one stage, he became overexcited and put a little extra oomph behind his pitch, causing the ball to land in the roof gutter. He fetched a ladder from the garage, stood it against the brick wall to the south end of the house, and clambered up to retrieve the lost ball. Wait a second, this feels very familiar, an inner voice erupted from someplace inside him. Suddenly, the disturbing dream came flooding back into conscious awareness, and he realized an identical train of real-world events was in the midst of unraveling. To obstruct the foreshadowed accident, he climbed to a position from where he was able to see the contents of the gutter without having to look down, and could retrieve the ball without any mishaps. Scanning the totality of the gutter's length, Mr. A saw the edges were jagged enough to induce deep cuts and abrasions. Interval, 2 days. Let's comment a little bit on this, right? So this is the commentary that comes afterwards. The associated waking event is a close recapitulation of the dream fragment. It's not exact, it's not precise, right? But there's a few, it's very analogous, okay? A compelling phenomenon here is that the outcome was rendered mutable when the participant became acutely aware that something was being repeated. Coming to be states appearing in an observer's field of presentation, then, represent the most likely outcome and are not absolute by any stretch of the imagination. Volition is, without a doubt, a key player in determining outcomes, but its creative powers are severely blunted by our perceptual blindness to the full continuum of non-local states that await selection in the imminent future. Okay, so somehow this veridical information about what I was going to do came into my dreaming cognition, right? I wasn't aware that this was a precognitive dream episode until 2 days later. I had forgotten about the dream during that specific time. I hadn't remembered it, right? Then all of a sudden I'm playing with this tennis ball, right? And I throw it up on the roof, and then I start climbing the ladder, and all of a sudden the dream comes back, right? I remember it. And I'm like, oh, what happened in the dream? This happened in the dream, right? I ended up with a laceration. How can I skew that? Well, I'm going to climb all the way up and then look down before searching for the ball with my hand, right? It's an interesting phenomenon, definitely, right? But as we saw, a precognitive dream sequence illuminates, it doesn't illuminate something absolute, right? It illuminates a likely course of events if I remain unconscious of those events, right? If at some stage I become conscious of this precognitive trail, then I can engage in some kind of action, right, that will disrupt that outcome from eventuating.
So Paul, one of the things that you discuss in your book are different scientific paradigms, and you compare the dominant isms of the 19th and 20th century, materialism and positivism, and you talk about something that I haven't heard anywhere elsewhere but your book, the Gaia-based empirical philosophy,
Yes.
and how precognitive dreams don't necessarily fit into the predominant scientific paradigms, and you provide this really compelling example with the cerebral achromatopsia. Can you tell us a little bit more about your views on how the scientific paradigms kind of affect incoming information that we receive in the scientific physics field, and share a little bit more about that example for our viewers?
Yeah, absolutely. My general feeling is that we have primitive simplifications and systemizations that occur in science and can ossify science, right? Or the movement of science, the progress in science. It happens in many different disciplines. In medicine, I suppose, in biology, psychology, etc., etc. So I draw a parallel between precognitive dreams and their inability to fit into a materialistic frame of reference and the turbulent history of clinical neurology, for instance, right? And I do reference cerebral achromatopsia. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about these systemizations, these primitive simplifications that have occurred in clinical neurology, right? And then bring it back to our discussion with precognitive dreams, right? So from what we know now, right? So now we live in a time where we think of visual perception, right? And we think that the visual image or what the brain receives isn't analogous to a camera or an image, right? So does that make sense? Okay, so the image isn't projected into the brain, right? So there's no single representation of the visual image in the cortex. But what we do have is specific modules, right? Each with a partial but distinct role in creating the image that we perceive, right? So the brain builds the visual image, right, from raw materials, right? That's an acknowledged, it's part of the scientific status quo now, right? It's acknowledged by all scientists, it's veridical, right? It's truthful, it's veridical. However, that hasn't always been the case, right? So we think back, to the 1800s or 1700s, 1800s, right? And we think of Newtonian optics, right? And the whole idea of, the brain or the visual cortex being like a camera, right? So the visual cortex basically just receiving a representation of the visual image and it's projected into the brain, and then that's it, right? So, if we return to 200 years ago, right, we would say, okay, there's no. If I said to you 200 years ago, look, visual perception, it doesn't quite work like the way that we think it does. Actually, the brain actually constructs the visual image by collecting data, and there's different modules that are underpinned by different neural networks that will collect different data, right? Color, wavelength, depth, right? Or whatever, and then it's all amalgamated in the brain, right? And then you'd probably turn around and say, Paul, you're a bit crazy here. What you're suggesting is counterintuitive, right? So does that make sense?
Yeah, if it was 200 years ago and we thought that our vision was just, it's like a camera, there's only one reality, only one image, it's projected in our brain. It would sound crazy if you said there's actually, you're perceiving what you're perceiving in all of these different little parts of your brain, and then it's coming together.
Yes.
It would sound crazy.
Yes, that's exactly right. So in truth, it's not a datum, replete with, with color, wavelength, depth, movement, right? So the brain will actually assimilate little bits of information through different neural networks and then combine that as a product in the brain. Okay, it's quite fascinating to think that visual perception is componential and analytic and constructive. It's a constructive process.
It is.
Right? Yeah.
Because it happens so quickly.
Absolutely, right? It's very unconscious. We don't necessarily think about, this is what's being combined with, this aspect of visual perception is being combined with this aspect of visual perception. It just happens automatically, right? And it's very counterintuitive. So back in the 1800s, you had a specific doctor by the name of Louis Very, and he was a Swiss neurologist, right? So, and one of his patients had a stroke. Okay, so, and then the outcome of the stroke was hemiachromatopsia, right? So the loss of the ability to see, perceive, imagine, remember colors in half of the hemifield. Okay, so can you imagine, how unusual that would have been? Like, coming from a patient perspective and saying, okay, these are my deficits, this is my neurological deficit, these are my symptoms, this is what's happening to me. And then the doctor reported this, right? So in the clinical literature, and he said, he reported this as a veridical case, and so it was, he transcribed it, he reported it, but then we had some 75 years unfold, right, and elapse without any further mention of cerebral achromatopsia. And why is that so, right? It is because the specific idea of a color center in the brain was very incongruent, incompatible with the scientific status quo, the predominant paradigm of the time, the dominant paradigm of the time, right? Which was to believe that vision was seamless.
It's interesting, the irony of this case where we're talking about vision and the perception of something outside of the dominant scientific paradigm is literally unseen.
Yes, that's correct. Yes, it's under rug swept, right? Or people pretend that it's not there. They'll think that the patient is making it up, right? It's confabulated or fabricated, right? And that's not necessarily the case, right? And the way that certain developments in science are made and the way that science moves forward is through exploration of these anomalous phenomena, because at that time cerebral achromatopsia would have been an anomalous phenomenon. Okay, so let's fast forward a bit to 1922. We had a specific doctor by the name of Gordon Holmes, right? Holmes, rather, who was a war doctor, and he published, I think, a series of 200 cases, right, of injuries to the visual cortex. And apparently none of these exhibited what we might be able to define as cerebral achromatopsia, right? Or loss of color perception, right? A discrete loss of color perception. Why is that? Because it was an empirically based antagonism against the idea of a color center in the brain, right? So he was biased against it, therefore he didn't see it, right?
He wouldn't ask about it, or
exactly.
If it was reported to him, he might kind of ignore it, which, you know, as you were describing this, I think about what it would have been like for people who experienced it and how alone and scared they would have felt. And
very invalidating, right? Just like there are people in our days who have anomalous experiences, precognitive dreams, for instance, right? Out-of-body experiences, right? Near-death experiences, past life memories. And when they attempt to describe these to clinicians or just a usual layperson, what happens? That it's an invalidating experience usually for them, right? Because people will try and explain it away in a specific way. We'll say, okay, well, maybe you imagined, or maybe this was a hallucination, right? So, yeah, it can be very invalidating, right? And it can feel very judgmental as well.
It can feel very judgmental, and it kind of, the paradigm that at least I've experienced when I share my own anomalous experiences is sort of like, you are in control, you are the creator of your life, and anything outside of that it doesn't exist.
That's exactly right. Yeah, totally right. So here we have, going back to the clinical neurology example, so here we have 75 years where cerebral achromatopsia just completely disappears from the clinical literature. No one mentions anything about it. It's just gone, right? Dissipates from the purview of the clinical literature. Then, say in 1958, David Hubel and Torsten Wiesel make a very explosive discovery. Quite by accident, they find that cells in the primary visual cortex of the brain, right, are responding to what? Edges, demarcations, lines, contrasts of light and dark, right? So a very rudimentary piece of the visual image, right, of the image itself, right? So that was kind of counterintuitive. They didn't expect to discover it, but that's what they actually discovered, right? And a logical conclusion that they drew from that was that visual perception is analytic and componential and integrative in nature, right? It's not like a datum given, right? A projected image into the brain, right? What we were saying before. That changed the intellectual climate, right? It made it more receptive to the idea of functional specialization, right? The idea that certain parts of the brain might be specialized for certain things, right? We know that for a fact, right? So V2, for instance, right? In the occipital lobe, the primary visual cortex is V1, right? So that analyzes lines, contrasts of light and dark, edges, right? Kind of like it functions as an edge detector. Then we have V2, which is another part of the visual cortex, which analyzes disparities of depth. Then we have other, like V4, which is the center which is responsible for color, wavelengths and color, V5 for motion, and so forth. And then one other discovery, I suppose, to conclude with this clinical neurology example, is Semir-Zeki. So we have Semir-Zeki, post 1960, right, who utilized macaque monkeys in experiments, and then found, using single electrodes, that a specific area of their brain was responding to wavelengths of color. right? And this happened to be the same area that was illuminated by Louis Very as being the center of the chromatic color center, colors perception, some 75, 80 years beforehand, right? Yeah. So there you go. So we return to the same ground. So we were a little bit of back and forth, random accidents, you know. We end up cycling back to the same point where we were with Louis Very, right? Identifying cerebral achromatopsia as a veridical neurological deficit, right?
Yeah, it's interesting as you're, you write about this in your book, and as you're describing it here, something that occurs to me that fits in with the kind of paradigms at the time is the accounts from people, like the first person who described cerebral achromatopsia, whatever,
right. Yeah.
Wasn't taken seriously or wasn't believed. It was only until some kind of scientific experiment, quote unquote, proved the existence that it was taken seriously.
Yes, there has to be a shift in the intellectual climate, right, that makes the client receptive to that specific idea. If an idea or a phenomenon is very incompatible or incommensurate with the intellectual climate, the unconscious philosophical attitude of the time, it will not be accepted, right? It will be under rug swept, turned into something else. People will pretend that it doesn't exist. Right, under rug swept, let's just say that, right? Researchers or clinicians might say that the person's fabricating it, right? They're pretending that this is authentic when it's not, etc., etc. Yeah, so it creates a lot of problems for the patients as well. Do you know what I mean? For the clients, So yeah, and then then we have in 1983, for instance, so like another subsequent discovery. So in 1983, we had Joseph Zeil. Right, and he was the one who discovered cerebral echinotopsia, right? The fact that, so one of his clients had a stroke, again, right, another stroke, which usually leads to a focal neurological deficit. And this particular client would look at something like a moving object or say a moving car, and he would see the car if it was stationary, but then when it started moving, it would disappear from consciousness, from conscious awareness, only to reappear somewhere else seconds later, right, or moments later afterwards, right? So he wouldn't see, there was no fluidity of motion. The fluidity of motion was lost. It was seen as an accumulation of static images. Like the visual field became an accumulation of static images, which would be like a mind-blowing experience, right?
It would be, because we take our perception so seriously and just kind of assume that it's the way that the world looks, but to experience that dramatic shift in perception and realize that the outer reality isn't reflected in the inner reality, or there's just a disconnect between the two.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it's just amazing. And what he said was that a cerebral echinotopsia was accepted, outright, because it didn't experience, or it didn't conflict with the status quo of the time. Do you know what I mean? Right. So there had been all these previous discoveries, right, which shifted the intellectual climate, right? It's something fascinating, and I feel that little narrative in clinical neurology, right, is a reflection of the trajectory of consciousness studies in general, right, and anomalous phenomena, and how anomalous phenomena are dismissed, right, because they don't fit into the dominant paradigm of the time, the dominant scientific paradigm of the time, which in this day and age is a materialistic frame of reference, right? It's reductive, right? It's physical, what we call physicalism, right?
Only what can be
studied and measured or quantified actually exists.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting to tie that segment of the turbulent time in clinical neurology, as you put it, something like that. I love that. When I was reading your book, I just felt my mind expanding, thinking about, and I love thinking about it. It's just to have that feeling of mind expansion is such a special treat. And
it feels like you're in the gestalt. You know what I mean? You're trying to get the bigger picture, right, of what's actually going on. And like one of the things that I always think about is, okay, So, what was revealed to me through that specific example, the turbulent history of clinical neurology, was that the brain is somewhat like a transfer and storage device for wavelengths of consciousness, right? So, for instance, which part of the electromagnetic spectrum can we perceive, right? It's between 450 and 700, I think it's nanometers, 450 and 700, yeah. So, which isn't that much, right? So it's a very small part. Everything outside of that outside of that purview, is not amenable to, I suppose, conscious awareness. It's not amenable to analysis, cognitive analysis. It's pretty interesting to think that, right? So we can't necessarily perceive it, so we can't affect it either, right? Yeah. So we suffer from cognitive closure, as I always say.
Yeah. That reminds me of another thing that you talk about in your book. The quality of how we are perceiving things in our day-to-day life versus how we perceive things in our dream, and how there can be more vividness and there's not that sense of time, and how that might be reflective of these other parts of reality that we're not.
That's exactly right, yeah. And the whole fact that I suppose our brain constructs, unidimensional notion of time, right? The fact that it's linear, right? That could be a construct of the brain, just like so many other things, right? I'm pretty sure the brain screens out bits of information that we don't need for our survival, right? So I suppose it's an evolutionary, it's kind of wired into us in an evolutionary sense, right? That things that aren't necessary for our survival, for our individual survival, collective survival, are screened out of conscious awareness, right? By the frontal areas of the brain, by the prefrontal cortex or whatever, right? Before they actually reach awareness.
That reminds me of another thing, and I'm kind of jumping to another thing here. So there's this thing that I heard recently about how it was this woman who believed that angels exist and that we can communicate with them and can communicate with all sorts of spirits if we kind of have the thought that we are open to having them communicate with us, that we are open to receiving parts of their will, and they're welcome in our space. And it was interesting to kind of think about this idea of will and kind of what you talk about with free will, and I don't know what connection I'm making exactly. I guess there's two things that kind of go with that for me, is the Liebe experiment.
Yes.
And then we talked about it last time, but I'm still stuck on it.
We touched on it, right?
Or a different thing. The Liebe experiment, as well as this idea of self in different dimensions of time.
Right.
It's just, and that we might give ourselves messages, and how that kind of ties into free will also, which we talked about.
Yes.
I'm so stuck on that.
Yes, and I think many of those ideas are very compatible, right? So precognitive dreams, the idea of precognitive dreams is very compatible with Benjamin Liebe's free will experiments, right? So which is very, very interesting, and then that is very compatible with the notion of serial time, the fact that there's different dimensions of time, time 1, time 2, time 3, and higher dimensions of time measure the time which sits below it, right? Which is subservient to it. So time 3 would measure time 2 measures time 1, right? It's sometimes a little bit complex to get your head around these sorts of ideas, but once you study them, you start to see that there's some kind of correspondence between them, and that it can't be all confabulated or imagined, right, by the theorist, right? The theorist has some kind of, empirically based, knowledge to go on. So talking about Benjamin Liebe, and I think that maybe we need to explore that a little bit further. So Benjamin Liebe is important in this specific discussion for several reasons. So the first one is that he obviously examined the notion of consciousness, right? And he examined specifically the correlation between physical neural events in the brain and consciousness, right? So mental events, right? And that he understood that there was a correlation between these. So he grappled with the idea of free will, if free will actually exists, and if it is examinable, right? through a more neuroscientific lens, or more of a scientific lens, rather than through speculative philosophy, for instance, right? And we spoke a little bit about it in the neuropsychology class.
Yeah,
right?
his experiments is fascinating.
Yes.
What he was able to craft, the creativity.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, it was extremely creative. And one of the things that he did, or what he did in this specific experiment, was that he got individuals to sit in front of a clock, I think, with a rapidly rotating spot, right, like a white spot. And his participants, he divided them into two groups. One group had to indicate when they were going to make the decision to move, right? But it was capriciously expressed. In other words, it was random. It was a random movement. And then the other group had to tell him, had to actually pre-plan the movement, right? And then express it, and then move, right? So it was a specific motion that they were supposed to do. So the whole idea was that there was this clock there with a rapidly rotating light, right? And then the individual would tell Benjamin or whatever other investigator was there that, okay, I'm gonna move. Okay, so now I'm taking the decision to move, right? And these experiments showed, right, certain things came to light. So one of the things that came to light was that, so the decision to move, right, the decision to actually move, right, preceded neuromuscular activation.
Right, because they had the electrode.
That's exactly right, yes. It was an EEG examination. So it was the electroencephalogram, right?
And did they also have like skin,
Yes. Yeah, I don't... From memory, it was an EEG experiment, right? So they were wired up to an EEG machine. I'm not sure if they were measuring galvanic skin response. I don't think so. There would be no reason why they would be doing that. But it was an EEG experiment, right? Anyway, so what he found was that so the person decided to move, or the decision to move preceded the actual neural event, the activation of the neuromuscular junction by about 150 to 200 milliseconds. Okay. So you decide to move and then you move, right? Which makes sense in terms of the temporal sequence, that you would first take the decision to move, and then, there would be a cackling of activity in the neuromuscular junction, right? Right, which would, so that the act could come to fruition. But he also found something else, right? So we know that the decision to move precedes the actual move by a 150 to 200 milliseconds, right? Which is about a fifth of a second, right? But what he also found in examining the results, right? And then after standardizing and examining the results, was that there was a cackling of activity, right, in the supplementary motor cortex, roughly a third of a second before the individual decided that they were going to move. Right?
Let's take a moment for that.
So let's just take a moment to contemplate the implications, right? What are the implications here? The implications are that, so my decision to move was initiated unconsciously by the brain, right? So it was unconscious. It was an unconscious decision that was made at some stage. So who made that decision for me? Do you know what I mean? So if there's salient electrical activity in the supplementary cortex a third of a second before you decide or you make the decision to move, what does that actually mean, right?
Yeah, because it's a very it's not like just moving around where you're like, okay, my body's kind of getting more comfortable. It's like, okay, I'm deciding that I'm going to put my finger there. So how come there's part of our brain that is making the decision to make that movement before another part of our brain is consciously aware of it?
That's exactly right? Is it a part of the self, a part of the higher self that's activating this part of the brain? Like, what is it? Do you know what I mean? So how would you interpret that? How would you interpret that? And obviously there's implications for free will, for the whole determinism versus non-determinism battle, right? So we know that we have various philosophers that take a more reductive approach and say that we're, victims of our, genetic and neurological makeup, right? And that, we're victims of these inveterate patterns that exist that are encoded in our neural networks, and then you have other people that believe in free will, right? In non-determinism as a veridical concept, the fact that you can influence the environment, the social environment, right? That you can subjugate it, that you can maneuver, manage, control certain things, right? So which is it? Is it on this side, is it determinism or is it non-determinism? And that dualistic approach, I think, can be deceptive, right? And erroneous in many ways, right? Why do we have to take an either-or standpoint?
I love how I believe this is how you reference it in your book, is a soft non-determinism.
That's correct.
I love that
Yes, that's
term.
correct. Yes, or a reciprocal determinism, which means that the environment can affect you and you can concurrently or inversely affect the environment, right? So it's a two-way street, right? And how do we know that? There's been subsequent lesion studies that have revealed that when we lesion, for instance, the primary motor cortex or the premotor cortex, right, it impairs movement, which is externally motivated, right? So what does that mean? So if that tree over there was to fall here, right, that would motivate movement on our part, right? We would move to get out of the way, right, so that doesn't strike us and kill us, right? The self-preservation would kick in, right? So that's when you lesion the premotor cortex. When you lesion the supplementary motor cortex, right?
What does with the experiment?
Yes, exactly. When you lesion the supplementary motor cortex, what gets impaired then? Intrinsically motivated movement.
Interesting.
So basically, I look at, okay, so I want to do something, Jess, right? I want to pick up this book. I decide that I'm going to pick up the book now. I'm just going to tap it against it, right? That's intrinsically motivated movement.
And the supplementary motor cortex, that was what was getting fired up before the person was consciously aware.
That's correct.
Interesting.
That's interesting, yeah. So, trying to work out the nature between, these neural networks, right, and volition, right? So what, the way that he interpreted it was that the 150 second or 200, the 150 or 200 millisecond gap between the decision to move and the expression of the motor act was enough time to veto the act from coming into being, all right? So basically in that 200 milliseconds, I could stop the act from playing out, right? I could stop the motor act from coming to fruition, right? That, in a way, can be construed as free will, right? Or some limited version or some limited conception of free will, right? The fact that there's all these unconscious processes that are randomly, coming about, through electrochemical activity in the brain. However, we can veto many of these unconscious actions from coming into being, right? So we do have some degree of control, right?
Interesting too, as you're describing that, I'm thinking, as you're describing the reciprocal determinism and the different experiments that kind of show the way that the brain interacts with the environment, and when things are lesioned, how that changes what movement happens in terms of different cues or decisions. And it's interesting because it sounds a lot like interconnectedness, and that's something that the spiritual community talks about a lot, and this kind of like older, or maybe not older wisdom that's inherent in some spiritual communities, but because it's a spiritual community, is not necessarily taken as seriously by the scientific community.
Yes, that's exactly right? Because a lot of times we're attempting to examine non-physical events, right? And science doesn't quite have the tools, or at least at this point doesn't have the tools to examine non-physical events, right? Empirically, yeah. Right? So bringing this in line with precognitive dreams, bringing Benjamin Libet's experiments in line with precognitive dreams, right? So we spoke about a specific precognitive dream that I had.
Yes.
Right? Okay. So let's think about that. I had this precognitive dream, right? Which felt, like it had a deterministic color, right? This was what was going to happen, right? In the end, it didn't end up panning out that way because I became aware, right? I became aware of this specific dream, and then I was able to change the outcome, right?
You made it different. You vetoed.
I made a conscious veto. I made a conscious veto at that time, right? It was like, okay, this is the way that this is going to pan out, but I'm not going to allow it to pan out like that, right? Because I'm going to change the trajectory of my actions, right? Which would lead to a very different outcome, right? So that falls directly in line with the soft reciprocal determinism, which is my preferential position.
That also freaks me out, your dream, your precognitive dream, in the sense that in the string of events that make up your life, you not getting cut, it seems like something that's small, but what if it was something that changed the whole trajectory of your life? Exactly. Which is, for whatever reason, it's like the butterfly effect, and that movie is really disturbing, and it's kind of a disturbing thought for some reason. I guess that's the other thing that you speak to in your book, that these things that are ambiguous, that we don't fully understand, can be really frightening.
That's exactly right. Yeah, absolutely right. It's the whole thing, I mean, like, you explore different avenues and different areas and different disciplines, and then you see how there's correlations between many of these, right? And they start to tell us, they start to combine or amalgamate and show us a certain, they point in a certain direction. You know what I mean? So even Benjamin Libet's interpretation was that, okay, I'm going to save the whole concept of free will, right, by construing it this specific way, by saying that the 150 to 200 milliseconds between your actual, making the decision and, the actual murder act itself was enough time for you to actually veto the act, means that we can, to some degree, control the environment, not say the environment, but on a micro level, right? The environment or how things pan out for us. Right.
It's interesting too. Another thing that's coming up for me is, so in the serial time and the dimensions of time, there's the idea of kind of our more expanded selves.
Yes.
So in your precognitive dream, you might have been getting a message from a more expanded self. And then you make this decision to veto, but it wasn't necessarily just your will at stake there.
Yes.
This is information that you got from perhaps a more expanded version of yourself, or who knows what.
Yes, absolutely. And the whole expanded version of somehow we can come into contact with that part of ourselves in altered states of consciousness, at least more readily than what we would in waking conscious awareness or during that specific time, right? Something to do with the brain activity as well, right? Suppose, right? So there's something about that state, right? Being in, suppose theta wave sleep, right? Or in the alpha more relaxed state, where we can make contact with those, I suppose, expanded aspects of self. Let's just call it that for the time being, right? Yeah, right.
That's a whole other can of worms.
Absolutely, yeah.
Call it something else.
Yeah.
That's...
lack of a better word, right? Because,
Yeah, that's the interdisciplinary. This is also going back to another thing.
Yeah.
This isn't directly related, but I did want to make mention of it.
Go for it.
So as we're having this discussion, I'm very aware of my own spiritual biases that I don't want to bring up because they're not talked about a lot. Even in our shared communities, it can still be a little bit scary to talk about for fear of being judged, rejected, invalidated, and what it's making. It's kind of bringing up another thought, something I remember you talking about in class. As an interdisciplinary scholar, you have had experience in philosophy and religion and psychology and neuropsych and writing. And something that you talk about in your book is sort of like the materialist kind of exclusion of anomalous experiences that don't fit in with how they understand things. But it's in a lot of disciplines. Like with philosophy, I remember you submitted a paper which tied neuropsych into philosophy, and because of the neuropsych, it was rejected.
That's right, yeah.
Which is
Yeah.
wild to me.
Yeah. So I think, I suppose some journals will only publish certain topics, right? And they want their topics to be very focused, right? So they don't necessarily like or are very amenable to interdisciplinary research. And I think that interdisciplinary research is the way to go.
It really is. Like last time after we finished the interview and we were just kind of spitballing, we were talking about quantum physics, which is totally interdisciplinary and makes so much more sense than classical physics.
Yes. Yeah, totally. Yeah, and then there's that side. I think these pedagogical boundaries that we impose and which are so manifest at universities, right? This is this discipline and we don't talk to this discipline, right?
Yeah.
And we have developments, in this discipline and then, another field, right? Which is, I suppose, parallel to, right? Or collateral field won't have knowledge of that specific discovery, which is really, to me, strikes me as very unusual and peculiar, because why wouldn't you want to know and understand about that specific discovery? Because it might give you a specific blueprint, right, to make your own discovery. Do you know what I mean, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Interconnectedness is also a concept in quantum physics and kind of this more biological view of physics that all organisms and ecosystems are interconnected. And however that knowledge came about, I don't know. But that kind of is a blueprint for like the motor brain lesion studies, and also is tied to spiritual communities, and it's really important knowledge.
Yes.
And that's just one thing.
Yeah, totally. What can we say, Jess, right? We're still, I suppose, in a proto-scientific phase of exploring the mysteries of the universe. Let's just say that, right? But unfortunately, right? But we're seeing, gradually we're seeing changes though, right? With the publication of certain books, right? I don't know if you've read Eben Alexander's book, right?
I don't know if I have.
Okay, yeah. So he was a neurosurgeon, right? Who had an OBE, right?
Oh yes.
Yeah. So he had a specific. He was near death, right? Meningitis, I think. So he was suffering from bacterial meningitis?
Jesus.
Yeah. And then he had
aware of what's happening.
Absolutely, and he had his brain is in the process of shutting down, and then he's having these vivid, paraphysical experiences, right? Yes. So of other realms and other places, and we're trying to explain, or in the aftermath, there were many scholars, scientists, clinicians that were trying to explain those phenomena, those phenomenally phenomenal phenomena, as I would call them, right? Or supernatural events, whatever term you want to use, from a specifically or discretely materialistic frame of reference, right? Because that's the only reference that they know, right? So,
It's even from the free will perspective and fate. It's interesting that this particular neurosurgeon or whatever. Neurosurgeon? He's a neurosurgeon. He's a retired neurosurgeon. So it's Proof of Heaven. The book is Proof of Heaven. It's called Proof of Heaven. It's the title's a little bit sensationalized, right? Because it's based on his personal experience, right? And each personal experience is apparently subjective, right? Subjective. It's not measurable, right? So it's not quantifiable by the objective standards of science. Right. Yes. Right, yeah.
Subjective. Yeah.
And everything that's tied to that word, all of the dirty baggage in the scientific community. Totally,
right? It's pretty. It was, I think, I ended up reading that book like many years ago, and I think there's been many books like that that have been published, that are pointing in a specific direction and encouraging individuals, people in the scientific community, people in non-scientific communities, to really think about their biases, their intrinsic biases, and challenge those biases, right?
Yeah, and as you're speaking about that, and thank you for bringing hope to this discussion, it strikes me that sometimes a person can benefit from having an anomalous experience, in order to allow that to be part of their worldview. And it seems like in terms of expanding free will's ability, however that works, precognitive dreams can kind of help with that.
That's exactly right. And I think it's difficult when you don't have, a philosophical frame of reference to understand that anomalous experience, and then, the world or the people that are part of the consensual scientific prerogative are telling you that this is false. This is like a product of your own imagination. It doesn't exist. You made this up. For some, it was unconsciously motivated for some specific reason, whatever, right? They'll dredge up any explanation to under rug sweep it. And that can be very invalidating, right? You can feel very judgy, right? You can feel very judgmental. And then the person just can't understand their experience. So it brings them to this kind of creative impasse, this intellectual impasse, right? And it can be the cause of a lot of anxiety. It can be very anxiety provoking, right? And they're just unable to process it and integrate it, right, into their frame of reference, which can, in some instances, lead to a specific mental illness or psychopathology, right? It can throw you out of balance, out of homeostatic balance.
Like schizoaffective personality disorder, and we've spoken about this,
yes,
and how one of the criteria is believing that you can read other people's thoughts.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Well, what if that actually happens?
Yes.
But that is in the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders.
Yes.
So you just wind up thinking you're crazy when you have this actual extrasensory special
Yes,
knowledge.
absolutely. And I'm pretty sure that, because there's a connection there, right, between psychosis and extrasensory perception. Not all instances of psychosis are extrasensory perception,
right,
or exhibit some form of extrasensory perception. But it's true that, many people who do have psychotic experiences, right, they can be extrasensory in nature. Not always, right? So not always. And then it's sometimes a little bit difficult to differentiate one from the other. When is it this versus when is it that? So, but at this point in time, the Western mind sciences, right, don't acknowledge the veridical existence, that it's veridical. There's a veridical phenomenon that actually exists separate, or is outside of ourselves, right, and exists in some objective way. So therefore, they under rug sweep it, right? They try and do away with it. They try and invalidate it somehow. It's a shame, but I think that things, will change.
So there's this thing that happens.
Yes.
Where. So you talk about different dreams that people have that are precognitive dreams, that they understand that information isn't communicated directly.
Yes.
And premonition, like the premonition from the prophecy of the Delphic Oracle, it's not communicated directly, but it's understood symbolically. And personally, if I had a dream, I consider myself to be an imaginative, creative, just amazing person. I would struggle with breaking it down symbolically, right. And that seems to be a kind of necessary skill, or maybe there's something about those particular, like you reference, I don't know how to pronounce his name correctly, August Kekule, and the dream about a snake biting its own tail, and how that inspired the creation of the simple structure for benzene.
That's right. Yeah. So he had a very metaphoric, figurative, allegorical dream, and he saw the Ouroboros, right, which is the snake that bites its own tail, which is a very ancient symbol, right? It was particularly used, I think, by the Gnostic sect of Christians, right, who retained the Great Mother in their Trinity, right? So it wasn't like three masculine deities. It was like the Great Father, Great Mother, and the Son, right? Anyway, so yes, I think what he had specifically was a hypnagogic image. So basically, I don't know what he was looking at, but he was sitting in a chair apparently, and he was in the state between sleeping and waking, right? So hypnagogic, so going into sleep, right? That state of very deep relaxation, and that's where he had that specific image come up, right, in his mind space, right, or in his cognitive space, and and I think it was animated too, like the snake was kind of biting its own tail and it was moving around, and then he was like, oh wow, maybe the structure of benzene is circular, right? So, and that's how he made that specific discovery. Fascinating stuff, right? And many scientific discoveries are made that way. They're made through metaphor, or the individual will have a dream, and the dream is itself the revelation, right? And then they'll wake up and they'll be like, oh, okay, like that's it, that's the actual answer, right?
It's fascinating that there's this history of dreams holding these valuable discoveries, and that it's not, it's not like you take a degree in biology and one of your classes is analyzing your dreams.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
It's not valued necessarily in what we learn.
Yeah. The way I think that the materialistic paradigm tries to explain it is that during when you're sleeping at night, the prefrontal cortex is in the veins, right? So, which allows ideas or slivers of ideas to recombine in unique or novel forms, right? And that's how you have a creative product actually arise during a dream state, right? Whereas when you're awake, you're conditioned in a specific way and you're thinking in a certain way, right? It's more analytical thinking, right? You're thinking rationally, so it's difficult to make unique connections between different bits of information when you're stuck, in that kind of way of thinking. It's pretty interesting, and it can be a compelling argument. Whether it's true in any objective way, I don't know, but we do know for a fact, I suppose, that many discoveries are made in the dream state, and it's usually a phenomenal, it's within a metaphoric, allegorical narrative, right? It's bequeathed in that kind of narrative, right? It's coloured in kind of like a metaphoric, allegorical narrative. It smells of intelligence almost. It smells very intelligent. It's almost like there's another part of self which is giving you that information. It's kind of being downloaded, right? If you want to use a computational, if you want to use a computational word, it's downloaded to you, right? From some repository of collective knowledge out there. So yeah, it can be a mystery. Right?
Something about that, what you said was so fascinating. I love that, the collective repository of knowledge.
Yeah.
And I think because you work with these concepts, in your day-to-day life, they can almost become, like the way you said it was like you were saying, something kind of mundane almost. It's like
totally
not mundane.
It's absolutely not. But I mean, it's very common for us to have impasses, right? Cognitive impasses when we're trying to solve a specific problem, when we're going through the act of problem solving, and then I'm pretty sure it's happened to you. It's happened to me.
It's happened,
for instance, and then I'll go to sleep and have a dream, and then I'll wake up and I'm like, that's the answer. I'm like, how did that come to me in a dream state? When my analytical capacities are apparently not there. They've abated. Really bizarre.
So what does it mean about knowledge? It's another
That's
thing.
exactly right. Yeah, there's different types of knowledge, right? I mean, we receive it there's different ways of knowing. Let's just say that. There's different ways of knowing, right? Yeah.
One thing that I am curious about, these people who have things come together that you describe in your book, that things come together in their dreams, or I love the story of the Delphic Oracle's prophecy, which maybe you can speak to a little bit. With the young men, he among you who first shall kiss his mother will hold the highest power in Rome, and how out of the three Roman soldier dudes, or whatever they were, one of them, Brutus, was able to understand the meaning of that from a symbolic reference, which allowed him to kind of fulfill the prophecy in a correct way by kissing the earth rather than actually kissing his mom.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, he did.
Yes.
And so there's this like intelligence in being able to understand things symbolically, and like, is that something that can be developed? Can I learn how to do that?
It could be intuitive. I don't know. Maybe you can develop it or cultivate it or hone it, right? I think that in the dream state, because a lot of what we see in the dream state does tend to be allegorical and symbolic, it's almost like there is this other part of self, right? Which is funneling information down to you. And then, you wake up and there's a specific narrative that you can remember. And then the way that you interpret that narrative will depend on your degree or level of sophistication. Does that make sense? I know that sounds, I hope that doesn't sound judgy or judgmental, but I think that there's this information that comes down to you, and then you'll read into it what you want. Do you know what I mean? Like, for example, you'll be able to understand it literally, right? Which is a very rudimentary way of understanding and interpreting. And then other times you might grasp other layers or levels of meaning that you hadn't grasped before, right? Someone who's more sophisticated or cultivated will see a narrative in a very different way, a specific metaphor in a very different way than someone who, for example, maybe hasn't gone to school, you know what I mean? Or hasn't developed certain talents, right? Or abilities.
Like, school isn't necessarily what, like, fosters that. But
not so much. It can give you certain tools.
Yeah.
Like, do you know what I mean? So that you can explore these different avenues or these ways of being. Like, like, for example, when you go to Sophia University, and you attend certain classes, you can be tutored. Right, there's certain didactics that will bequeath to you other ways of maybe encountering reality, right? And then you can use those. They can become part of your toolbox for understanding the universe. That's what I mean by schooling.
Yeah,
right?
That's a kind of different kind of schooling than the traditional.
Yeah. I'm not saying like going to like a conventional university like the University of Melbourne or Stanford University, because they're not going to teach you those sorts of things there, right?
So there is this, I think what I'm hearing from you too is there is a way to obtain a level of analysis to kind of play with these different levels of what the symbols could mean.
Yes.
And maybe it comes to someone naturally, maybe it comes through kind of these things that can be learnt.
That's exactly right. Yes, that's exactly right. And I think part of it would be native to who you are.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You're drawn towards certain disciplines and areas of inquiry because that's who you are fundamentally, right? So you're drawn to those areas. And then at other times, you might need specific tools or frames of reference, right? That are given to you or gifted to you from other people who have been in these disciplines or fields for a lot longer than you, right? And then you can use those to gain entryway into these other ways of knowing or whatever, right?
Abraham Lincoln, God knows how, or however he was able to, like, he wasn't a mystic or something like that.
Yes.
And he was able to symbolically analyze the precognitive dream that he had, pointing to his death, his assassination.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I think for the most part, the person that's most appropriate to examine, and interpret your dream is you, right? Because you know your life and who you are better than anyone else. That's why I'm very suspicious of these sensationalized books that are published on dreams. I think we've spoken a little bit about that maybe. Books that will, give you specific symbols, and they'll say, this is what this means if you see this in a dream, this is the meaning of this specific thing or symbol or whatever. And I'm very antagonistic towards those sorts of books. They're very entertaining, but I don't think there's anything else that they can offer over, other than entertainment, other than their entertainment value. I think that each person has to interpret their own dream, right? And a specific figure or color or symbol or whatever you want to call it, for you might mean something completely different for me. Do you know what I mean? And I don't think a book can impart that information.
So there's also this kind of skill or personality trait that can maybe also be developed if like this independence of thought and trusting one's own experiences.
Yeah, there's no cookie cutter approach to the interpretation of dreams, and definitely not to the interpretation of extraordinary precognitive dreams, right? So yeah, it's a fascinating area. There are certain individuals who have, I suppose, engaged with the whole topic of extraordinary precognitive dreams. They've conducted studies, right? Some notable studies into the condition. It remains on the periphery, the boundaries of conventional science, right? Not accepted by conventional science at the moment, but at some time in the future, who knows? They may be validated, and brought into the scientific paradigm, like cerebral achromatopsia, right?
Bringing it back full
circle. Yes, exactly. That's right. Yeah, just the way that cerebral achromatopsia was able to gain a voice, right, and be acknowledged as a veridical phenomenon, and focal neurological deficit. Nowadays, neurologists will hear and they'll, yeah, I know what that is, right? But that wasn't always the case, right?